The theme is dear to my heart about the nature of marriage and how we need to return to looking at God's plan. And as I considered what Brother Robert asked me to address, essentially in what causes failures and how to prevent it, if I can sum that up. And as we go back and take a look, I'm going to tell you two things. Number one, I'm providing a handout that will be in the back. Number two, the reason for that is you'll never be able to write down as fast as I'm going to have to talk tonight. I figure I need that disclaimer out there so you understand I know what I'm about to put you through. So as we consider this topic, I want us to think of marriage as it presents problems to us in society and that we realize God has the answers. You know, people have come to treat marriage as this rather ordinary thing today. And this happened long before the term gay marriage ever entered the vocabulary of America. I would argue instead it's a symptom of a much more extensive societal problem, because we failed to appreciate the unique beauty of marriage in society only after couple failed to stand by it within marriage. For many years, we have heard the statistic that 1/2 of all marriages end in divorce. Now, people somewhat dispute that, but it's because of the nature of the statistic. Many people marry multiple times. And so while there are many people who do live together and in marriage for long times, there's some that make up for that, for the number of times they marry. And so they represent a lot of failure. The fact is, though, that when I recently checked some stats online, I found that people are now gauging successful marriages by whether they last 10 to 20 years instead of for a lifetime. And that itself shows where we are in society. However, I would submit to you that marriages can fail even without divorce ever occurring. Because divorce is the lowest baseline possible to determine success. Hey, we didn't divorce. That's basically saying I had success as a parent because my child isn't a mass murderer. You know, good for you, but I'm not really that impressed. We fail in marriage when we follow the biblical model poorly. When we take it, we distort it, and we just say, this is good enough, instead of really reaching out to be what it ought to be. That's the real reason why all these divorces are happening anyways. People are not following God. There's another part of the equation, though, I think we need to address. We have to stop making excuses for our failures and instead start taking responsibility for them. And while a marriage can fail because one spouse, intentionally or otherwise, sabotages the relationship, we must respond biblically rather than selfishly. Because of this, and please make sure that everyone knows this around you, success in marriage is never accidental. It is always intentional. It is not the result of some people having fewer problems than others. Success in marriage is the direct result of two people learning how to navigate and eliminate tension areas in marriage successfully. And while I think a complete list of these would be impossible to address, tonight I'd like to give you 7 recommendations of how to avoid a failed marriage. Number 1, if you want to avoid a failed marriage, prepare for marriage diligently. A lot of times what I run into, the problem we have is we got people getting married who have no reason getting married. They haven't spent the time, they have not prepared themselves, they're not thinking about it, they're not taking it seriously enough. If our preparation for marriage tends to follow the world's model, why would we think that we would not inherit the world's problems? And yet that's what we've done. The whole way in which we prepare ourselves for marriage, we're just doing things kind of what the world does, and then adding a little bit of a Christian touch to it, thinking we're not going to get the world's problems. Now think about it this way. The modern world's dating approach focuses in this order. Physical attraction first, emphasizes the need to belong second, a coupling up. Third, it treats friendship as the outcome of that third, that we belong together, and ultimately we enjoy doing things together. And then finally, it celebrates long-term commitment as a lucky circumstance. That's the world and how they approach it. And there's a reason why it fails so much, because that is completely opposite of how God tells us to develop our love. God switches that completely around, and what do you find in Scripture? Matthew chapter 22, verse 39. That everyone, this is the second commandment, he says, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That is an agape love that has the long-term interest of that person at first, no romance whatsoever. This is what we do for all men, of care about them individually. That's first. Proverbs 18, verse 22 then says, if a man wants friends, he needs to show himself friendly. And there is a friend who's sticking closer than a brother. Develop friendships then within those body of people that you know and you love in a general way for the best interest of their soul. Now you develop friendships. Then among those friends, we develop a closer tie. Now in Romans chapter 12 and verse 10, we find there that Paul emphasizes the spiritual end, but the principle is still true. And that is, be ye kindly affection one to another with brotherly love, in honor preferring one another. Now we belong together in such a way based upon real love, true love, considerate love for the other's best interest. A time spent together doing things, belonging together comes as a result of that. And then Hebrews 13 and verse 4, marriage is honorable in all and the bed undefiled. That's the correct order in which to develop a proper marriage relationship. And yet we tend to follow the world's idea and flip it around and then wonder why we have trouble. And so couples fail to build the type of ties in this process that help them deal with disagreements and adversity, because they've come in that process to depend on their physical attraction and romance to carry them through those things. And that's mostly what people mean when they talk about we're going to live on love. And they don't really understand it matters what kind of love you're living on. That approach then tends to treat marriage as the answer to conflict rather than the place that the problems are only going to be exacerbated. So preparation for marriage requires preparing yourself for the roles of marriage, for the responsibilities of marriage, and for the challenges of marriage, which is why in Colossians 3, verses 18 and 19, it says, wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter against them. Those challenges, those roles and responsibilities, those are the paths to joy in marriage. But when people fail to appreciate the true purpose of marriage as spiritual growth and character development by learning to work together, it's no wonder you have problems, because your expectation is always on the other person growing to please you, rather than you being the type of person that doesn't have to be pleased. So what do we do to address this? And this is where we're going to go quickly, of how do you deal with this practically speaking. Number one, rather than accepting the pair-up culture the world pushes at an alarming age today, emphasize then learning to be a good Christian and a good friend to our young people, and that's where these things start. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things should be added unto you, Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. And then in John 13, 34 and 35, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Until young people understand those two principles, they're not ready for marriage. And that's what parents need to make sure they're teaching first. Second of all, expect a certain level of maturity before then considering any relationship that has marriage in mind. By that, I mean dating. We tend to push these things forward so quickly, we wonder that we've got immature people in very mature kind of situations, and we wonder why they go bad. It's because we're putting them in situations that they're not prepared for. We need to make sure we're preparing them for the maturity before we put them in those kind of situations. Thirdly, parents, do not cede this entire process to your children, but rather help them choose wisely. I know I'm out of the mainstream with just about everyone on this. Here's what I mean. You know how we do it today? We send our kids off to college, and they come home and say, this is the person I picked. I want a rubber stamp of approval. That is not the best way, because let's be frank, most young people don't have a clue what they're doing. I'm thankful for the ones who show some sense. But parents, your children are your children and ought to be guided in this. Now, I didn't say you choose I'm not talking about arranged marriages. But by the way, countries that have arranged marriages have a much better success rate in marriage than we do. So I wouldn't be pointing fingers at them. Why? Because they learned that they have to work things out. We, on the other hand, everything's optional. And it's that attitude that is hurting us so terribly. By the way, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 36 through 38, is this principle of the family's role. So here's what that means practically. For those of you who would be in this situation, go out less, spend more time with parents of each one. Return the home environment then of both families to the forefront to encourage genuine interaction that's centered on learning about one another and seeing how you are in your real environment, not the fake environment you get when you leave. Why? Because I want to know how a young man treats his mother. And that tells me how he's going to treat my daughter. And the same is true in the other way. Those other relationships in the home, that's real life. How do you deal with your siblings? Real life. How do you deal with conflict? That's real life. Instead, we've created a way in which you go out and it's all about the other person all the time. That's not real life. And therefore, it's not an environment that tells you whether or not this person is actually really prepared and that it's a proper match. Okay, big point number 2. Big principle. We need to commit to marriage and one another fully. If you're not ready to make that kind of full-on commitment, you're not ready for marriage. If you're already married, then your job is to commit fully, meaning you put everything you have into it. Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6, Jesus says that in the beginning he made them male and female. And then he quotes from Genesis 2, verse 24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, shall cleave unto his wife, the two shall become one flesh." And it's based upon that is what he says, "Therefore what God hath joined together, let not man put asunder," in verse 6. Fully, what are we talking about? Few people really appreciate the full ramifications of lifelong commitment. And we need to return to it. People today are often approaching marriage thinking everything will be pretty easy. After all, they're in love. That little starry-eyed look that everyone's so familiar with. We're in love. And then life hits them square in the eyes, and they wonder what happened. Marriage is a lifetime commitment, and that requires a commitment to deal with the bad as well as the good. Now, in the traditional wedding vows, which are sadly not being used as much, but people vow to marry for better or for worse. But rarely do they really consider what for worse might entail. If you can't be committed to deal with adversity, you're not really committed at all, my friends. If you're not committed to the end of dealing with a really horrible situation, you aren't committed. That's what commitment is. The world's view of marriage leads to people looking for an easy out because they do not value commitment. If it doesn't work out, I can jump out. I can get out. No problem. This isn't working. I don't like this problem. I don't want to deal with it, so I can jump ship. Find something else. No problem. And therefore, you find people creating new doctrines to justify divorce and remarriage. Whether it's the idea of thinking not under bondage in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 15, somehow frees a person, which that's not even what that's talking about, or later on in that chapter that you continue in whatever state you were in when you became a Christian. That's not what that's talking about either. We also find people imagining wrongs and redefining fornication to justify ending their marriage. Fornication involves a sexual relationship that is direct in some way. Person touching person. Galatians chapter 5, verse 19. That is the one reason that God has given to end a marriage and that where you can enter another one. The one. And yet we have a loosening of that. It's just another kind of attack on this whole situation. Why? Because I don't like to have to deal with the consequences. And so what happens is because marriage becomes optional, everything is optional today. And because of that, people check out, if you will, of their marriage when things get hard. They're just not there. And that makes matters worse rather than better. So how do we address this problem of commitment? Well, number one, couples should spend more time developing problem-solving skills instead of buying into this blame the other culture. So it's the other person's fault. Well, what are you doing to help? You know, in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 12, Adam was quick to point out that, this woman that you gave me, she gave the It's the fruit to me, and I ate it. Passing off the blame. And that's the first thing that people often do. That's not commitment. When you're wanting to shove the blame on the other person instead of thinking about what my responsibilities are, we need to be able to accept responsibility for my part in things. Also, focus on the positive reasons you married in the first place rather than the challenges that you're facing in the present. People who only can see what's going on right now and their unpleasant things tend to not make good decisions in the present. Genesis 2 and verse 23, so if Adam and Eve were having trouble, he needed to remember what he said earlier when he says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman because she was taken out of man. She's part of me. See, now we're blaming someone who's part of me. We need to go back to that. That's where commitment is. Why did I get into this in the first place? That's the context for your marriage. Thirdly, on this, never let the word divorce pass your lips or the thought cross your mind, even in a joking way. Never. It leads to dangerous places and problems. That is corrupt communication, if I ever heard it. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29, because once that is there as an option, it is on the table for everyone. And that becomes your context. It becomes the question of when instead of never. We need more people who are so committed where we rise to the challenges of marriage rather than running from them. And that, by the way, did you notice I implied that challenges are going to be there no matter what? Be strong in the Lord, the power of his might. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. Number 3, manage your money wisely. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust doth corrupt and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt and where thieves do not break through and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The right kind of treasure, by the way, the marriage should be what's treasured before the money. Now within that, we need to make sure we're treasuring properly with how we treat our money. Financial problems are one of the leading contributors to divorce in this country for a number of reasons. Most of it comes from living beyond your means and lacking self-control over your spending habits. And perhaps I'll throw in number 3, having little to no understanding of the general cost of living if you're just starting out. As a result, you find younger couples that especially get themselves into trouble because they're trying to live at the same standard of living that they lived at home with parents who've been working for 20, 25, 30 years to get where they are, and all of a sudden you've got kids that think that that's where you're supposed to just start, and that's what's natural. It isn't. And therefore, you have to change your thinking on it. And you have that with some unexpected costs, which, by the way, there are always unexpected costs. That leads direct to arguments about money and a blaming one another for the problem. You don't make enough, you spend too much. So all of that is really just demonstrating how money is a trigger that reveals character issues. It breeds argument and disharmony, but it leads to blame and distrust that then comes out in other ways. It adds stress to every conversation and every interaction you have. But at the core, it makes work and money and things too high a priority in your life. That's why there's a problem. And that takes the attention off the marriage. Godliness with contentment is great gain. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6. Verse 10 says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And this is one example why. So instead, we need to do a better job of addressing stewardship issues in marriage. We are to be good stewards, and a steward is supposed to be found faithful. It's required to be found faithful. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2. So what do you need to do? What do we need to implant in our thinking? Well, number 1, be realistic from the very beginning about taking care of what you need to take care of. 1 Timothy 5, verse 8 says, if any man does not provide for his own, he is worse than an infidel. Now, he's talking there, by the way, about taking care of your parents. But the principle is still true. Second of all, learn to follow a budget. In Luke 14, verse 28, though Jesus is talking about salvation, he uses the idea of budgeting, in this case for a nation, as a foundation for it. This is where he talks about counting the cost. Do you have enough money to do and pay for what you're about to buy? If you don't know, you need to not make that purchase. 3, make saving and giving essential parts of your plan. If you're not prepared to make saving and giving part of it, and by the way, both of those in a way are found in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 1 and 2, because the whole idea of laying back in store is the principle of I'm prepared. I know that I have to take a little bit out, a little bit out, a little bit out, if I'm going to have it to give at a certain time. That's saving so I can then give. Both of those should be part of what we are doing. 4, learn the difference between wants and needs. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. 1 John 2, 15 through 17. We need to make sure we're not just falling into the lust part of I want. There are a lot of things I want. And I know for a fact that while I, right now in my possession, and preaching from an iPad, holding an iPhone in my pocket, I know that just a few years ago I had neither of these things and life was fine. And sometimes we forget that life can be fine without the things we have, if we value the things that really matter. In marriage then, number 5, help one another make better choices, not worse choices, because marriage should encourage accountability and self-discipline. Help one another. Don't excuse it. And also work on all of this together rather than as competitors. We need to work together to make things work as a marriage, and that includes financially. It's a matter of recognizing how much money is there and being honest about it with one another about where the real issues are. But here's the final thing. In Revelation 2 and verse 9, there, talking to the church at Smyrna, Jesus said, I know that you are poor, but you are rich. So listen to me. Most important financial advice you'll ever hear, I think. Focus on your manner of living rather than on your standard of living. The way you live before God matters a whole lot more than the things you have. And when you focus that way, it'll improve everything about your marriage. Number 4. In your marriage, build a culture of unselfishness. And I worded it that way on purpose. It doesn't matter that you can point to a few things here and there where you have shown you're unselfish, if the rest of the time you are selfish. The culture of marriage itself should be unselfishness. That no one is super important in there. We are together in here. It's about us, not me. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, the Apostle Paul lays this principle out as the foundation for humility and service in the kingdom and what makes unity possible. Now, if it is what makes unity, and these attitudes are what is essential for unity in the church, then I submit to you those same attitudes are what make unity in marriage possible. Therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each one of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. Put that in your marriage. Selfishness drives popular culture. It does. You've got this bloated self-esteem issue that's been pushed for years, where people are encouraged to think of themselves that they deserve high praise for low effort and star status for a mediocre performance. And that's where we are. And that's the kind of attitude people bring to marriage. I deserve it. You notice that is the foundation for most commercials today? Why should you get this vehicle? Because you deserve it. Then people buy the vehicle and it's a clunker, and maybe they're right. You deserve it. But you see, more than all that, this has encouraged people to focus inwardly. And it's done so much they rarely consider other people's interest, other people's contributions, or other people's points of view. Now, we see that in the church, but I see it all the time in marriage. That the whole idea of other isn't present in something that has at its core the other. And you see it in a ridiculous extent as a problem in society when people share meaningless opinions on social media as if it's the greatest thing ever. Look at me. Look at me. My opinion is more important than anyone's. No, it's not. It's elevated essentially the shallow things of life as the basis for interaction in a way that makes deeper conversation practically impossible. And then we try to have marriage. But this general problem, it's become a real epidemic in ways because people have cheapened marriage. And you look around society, people are waiting to marry and just choosing not to marry at all. And then you have the idea of gay marriage. Marriage is becoming meaningless, which I think is what Satan was going for all along. And therefore people see it as being unimportant, unnecessary, and sometimes even treated as unnatural. That's a foolish opinion. It's an immature opinion, but it's also popular. But this is because people fail to appreciate the real purpose of marriage in the first place. Marriage is the best environment for spiritual growth on a daily basis that exists today or has ever existed. And here's why. It forces us to confront our differences, our weaknesses, and our needs in a way that can humble us and challenge us to improve. And that's exactly what we need most. But grow in grace and the knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. To him be glory both now and forever. Amen. 2 Peter 3, verse 18. What does God want you to do? He wants you to grow. He wants you to learn. He wants you to be better today than you were yesterday and better tomorrow than you were today. Marriage can help you do that if you understand that's what God wants you to get out of marriage. So here's what we need to do, practically speaking, in how we think. Number one, rather than seeing marriage as a power struggle, we should embrace it as a means to learn selflessness. You do not, going into marriage, appreciate selflessness. You need to learn it when you get married. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Ephesians 5, verse 22. Be unselfish. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. Unselfish. People spend their time arguing about the roles of whether a wife should submit and a husband is to love, and they fail to appreciate those are the roles, and the command of both is be unselfish. And instead, we end up arguing selfishly over the roles. You see what Satan did to us? See it from God's point of view, and you'll appreciate it. Second of all, learn to serve first, serve most, and serve best. This is Christ-like. Jesus said of himself in Mark 10, verse 45, the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. In your marriage, you should challenge yourself to be the unselfish one instead of, and by the way, the funny thing is people say, oh, I'm the unselfish one. Well, apparently not if you're going to brag about it. You see, we don't appreciate what we're trying to accomplish. Because when we really are humbling ourselves and being unselfish, we're not necessarily going to even notice it. Just be a servant to your spouse and what your spouse needs from you to help. Thirdly, ask yourself regularly what you can learn from your spouse's point of view. And make that the context of every discussion. What can you learn from seeing things through your spouse's eyes? Ephesians 5, verse 28, it said of the husband, that this is really what we're going for. Because, notice, he says, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Marriage is about gradually incorporating your spouse's point of view and making it part of your own. That's part of how you grow. When we doggedly hold on to our singular point of view, it means we're not growing at all to see the world as something other than me-centered. Your spouse gives you an opportunity to see it as something other than that. And therefore, Acts 20, verse 35, Jesus said to Paul, words recorded in Acts, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Live to give, and you will learn to love. Number 5, communicate with one another proactively. You want to avoid a failed marriage? Communicate proactively. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11, it says, therefore comfort each other and edify one another, just as you also are doing. Christian principle for Christians, but it applies in marriage. We have more ways to keep in touch today than ever before. You can Skype, you can text, you can do Facebook, you can call, you can tweet. We can also speak to face. I'm not sure, though, that that's true of everyone today. That's the ability we're losing most. But despite all of this, people seem to have actual real problems communicating. Because communication is more than just an exchange of words. Are you hearing me? It's more than an exchange of words. Communication implies that both parties have understood one another correctly. Many problems in marriage come because they're using these words and the other person is attaching different meaning to them. And before long, they're arguing about something that wasn't a big deal. Why? Because we don't know how to communicate and we won't take the time to learn. In your marriage, I don't care if you learn anybody else's language, you learn what your spouse means when they say things. We need to have an improvement on this because we have a great breakdown on this in society, especially in marriage. Many spouses will pass information back and forth to one another, but it often involves just the necessities of daily life. This is part of our problem. We're spending our time talking about the children or what to get at the grocery store rather than having any kind of quality exchange of ideas. And this is where spouses need to be more proactive. Because when you fail to communicate, you create a vacuum that often fills your spouse's mind with doubt and fear unnecessarily. When you're, by your nature, your communication, leaving room open for bad thoughts will find their way there. You communicate well and fill that void, and there won't be that problem. If you're to grow closer together over the years, you must learn to have conversations that transcend the moment and reflect personal views, your feelings, your fears, your hopes, and your dreams, because these are the things that are looking beyond now. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 12, Paul said, I know whom I believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. Now, take that idea of the commitment and the certainty and the hope and all that's represented there and think about those ideas being the foundation for what makes you communicate. What matters? What are you going to do? What pulls you together? Where you want to be in the future? Instead, people just end up talking about day-to-day life, and you let what's on TV or in the news dictate conversation. And that's sad. Instead, some recommendations. Number 1, eliminate assumptions about what your spouse is thinking, and instead have a conversation that clarifies the actual meaning. We get ourselves into trouble because we start assuming things. Oh, yeah, we can read one another's thoughts. Not as well as you think. I don't care how long you've been together. That's one of those things. Couples will come in. They've been together for less than a year. Oh, we're just finishing one another's sentences. I say, you need to have expand your vocabulary. You don't know as much about one another as you think. And so we need to make sure we're actually developing these things, because otherwise you get into these unnecessary problems and arguments. So that requires making time. This is the second recommendation. Make time for conversations of substance, conversations about the future, and conversations filled with laughter. Make time for these things. Sit around and find reasons to talk about things you're going to do. Sit around and talk about important issues, spiritual issues, problems that are going on that are big ideas. Spend time just laughing. Thirdly, encourage one another daily. Exchange compliments. Did you hear me? Exchange compliments, not condemnation. Hebrews 10, verse 24. Let us consider one another, to provoke one another to love and to good works. It's good for Christians, it's good for marriage. We should be having conversations that are positive, that are helpful, that build one another up, and that provoke us to do good things in the home and for Christ. Fourthly, make that communication as personal as possible. The more difficult the subject matter, the more it should be handled face to face with grace. Now, why do I have to say that? Because the number of people that come to me with problems who've been trying to handle their issues texting one another is growing. And the nature of it, trying to handle a problem over texting, which does not communicate well, any kind of tone, and that most people just try to figure out what they mean at all is hard. That's not the way to do it. We need to make sure, let your speech be always with grease, seasoned with salt. He was talking there about people in general. How much truer should it be of the one you're closest to? With favor. That is, you are wanting in the way in which you communicate to express favor, where they feel your favor, your grace, your thankfulness for them in how you address them. Number 6. I can count. Develop emotional intimacy. Develop emotional intimacy. Seems strange you'd have to bring that up in marriage. That's something that needs to be done, isn't it? I argue it's missing in most marriages and why they fail. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Therefore, man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's intimacy. Matter of fact, the reason why that verse is quoted so many times in so many different contexts in the New Testament is because it captures the whole of intimacy. We have settled for a rather shallow view of intimacy over the years, because by allowing it to serve as this euphemism for physical intimacy, society in general has lost sight of what intimacy actually includes. Intimacy is about knowing and being known in a deep, personal way. It's about opening yourself up and being vulnerable, and also about loving a person even while fully aware of their flaws and weaknesses. Intimacy. It is a care that seeks unity through shared emotions, shared experiences, shared priorities, and shared values. We go back to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 2. Fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Intimacy. In marriage, that is heightened even more. And yet couples rarely take the time and trouble to share these kind of things with one another. And that's the problem. Developing intimacy, first of all, requires personal reflection on all those things. But we fill our lives with so many distractions today that we have little time to fill them with intimacy. We're running all over the place. We got Kevin's taxi service going this way and that way, and I've got to go this. And it's just stuff. It's not special. God designed marriage to be special. And that means we're not making the best use of our time and redeeming it, Ephesians 5 or 16. Instead, though, of having intimacy, we wall off portions of our heart to protect ourselves from getting hurt. Why? Well, the easy answer is because we've been hurt, correct? And part of that is we've been introducing romantic type of relationships far too early to our young people. We've got a lot of hurt people who don't know how to open up because their main experience is being hurt and it going away. You can get hurt when you're older too. But if that case, until you get over the hurt, you're not really in a good position to marry until you're really ready to deal with it. The world has conditioned us to expect to be hurt in relationships, to hurt one another in relationships, and to accept hurt in relationships, so that we're left with relationships that keep people at a distance from one another instead of helping them grow closer through a lifetime. How do we overcome that? 6 ideas. 1, create deep trust in one another by being deeply trustworthy, especially regarding one another. You want to get close and be truly emotionally intimate, there's never going to be any question but you're getting the truth and the whole truth from one another as you can say it. Let your yes be yes and your no, no. That's the first thing. When we end up hiding everything, and I mean big, important things from one another, and we're showing that you can't really trust what I say, you're creating barriers to intimacy. Matthew 5:37 is the quote. Allow yourself, second of all, to be vulnerable to your spouse. I know that's a kind of this catchword that's thrown around today. People that throw it around don't even know what it means, I'm convinced. But being vulnerable means you allow yourself an opening to be hurt because you first trust that you won't be. But that's where the development of a relationship that's mature, that shows this as a trustworthy person, is key and central to marriage. It's when you know you can trust that you can be vulnerable and therefore you can be intimate. It's part of letting others love you and learning how to love others. You see, every time you're keeping part of you away, that part can't be loved. Now, I didn't say that is just an open book immediately the moment you say, I do. It's a peeling back often over time as you grow to trust more and more and more. And that's how you can grow to love more and more and more. Listen to connect with one another. This is part 3. Listen to connect with one another. There's listening in marriage, and then there's hearing. I heard you. Well, what did I say? I don't know. You said something, but the TV was on, or I was reading something. But I know. Listen to connect, and that's why these conversations that are direct, where you get eye contact. Sometimes I think that maybe I need to stop at this point. And anyone who's married, make them look at one another right now, just because it may have been a while, so you see what the color of the other person's eyes are. Look at one another, eye contact, and connect, and have that conversation about real things. Pay attention to differences in point of view so that you can grow and understand, not so you can criticize and demean. Usually what happens is there's small little things that we have to listen to as cues of where the misunderstanding is. So many things can just be misunderstandings, and we have to be really paying attention to the other person to catch it, because they just word things and we're not on the same kind of page. Take the time. Don't just start off by figuring that there's a reason where I know I'm right. That's where now we've got a problem where better attention in intimacy, now I understand communication better. Fifthly, speak and act to unify your hearts, not to assert yourself or insert yourself. When you're interacting, it ought to be about making it about that other person and making them feel valued while you're interacting, not you will hear me. I will hear you. That is not just about communication, it's about the context in which you interact. And 6, for greater intimacy, focus on spiritual unity, and you will find greater room and opportunity for emotional intimacy. Endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Ephesians 4, verse 3. Think about how that applies in marriage, and your intimacy will grow. Number 7, love one another maturely. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8, it says, "And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins." Please put that in your marriage vocabulary. As we began, we noted how the world's approach to love has created numerous problems in marriage. The good news is that the biblical approach to love can correct those same problems, every single one of them. But we must have the heart and the spiritual maturity it takes to address our problems with love to solve them. Worldly love focuses on personal agendas and drama. And people wonder why their relationships remain shallow, distant, volatile, and short-term. Real love focuses on character. Yours. You know how often people come in and it's always the other person needs to change? Focus on your character. Greater love hath no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends, John 15, verse 13. So often people spend all their time in a relationship trying to fix the other person, and they completely neglect trying to work on themselves. That's the problem. Real love sacrifices for the other, serves the other, prioritizes the other, and commits to the other. That's agape love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish but have everlasting life, John 3:16. And this is not simply a matter of vows made on the wedding day, but the essence of a relationship lived day to day. 1 Corinthians 13, if you'll turn there, we're going to put this together. Verses 4 through the first part of verse 8 is what is often read at marriage ceremonies. I want to read it, and then I'm going to give you practical applications in marriage of each one of these principles. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. We read that, it's beautiful. I don't think we get it, though, when we're being wed. What does it look like? In marriage, number one, lose your attitude, not your temper. Number two, be kind to one another in word and action. 3, as much as possible, do those little helpful tasks that make life easier on the other. 4, give more than you take in things and in disagreements. 5, draw attention to the good qualities of your spouse, not yourself. 6, act in a way that your spouse will feel comfortable and appreciated. 7, do what is best for your spouse, especially when it is difficult. 8, do not be easily offended. 9, do not keep a list, mental or otherwise, of perceived grievances. 10, live each day to help your spouse go to heaven. 11, accept idiosyncrasies as natural and endearing. 12, give one another the benefit of the doubt regarding motives. 13, expect a bright future together, always. 14, prepare to face hard times together and be closer to one another as a result. And 15, love one another to the end so that you can love one another in eternity. That's what comes from a practical application of this passage in marriage. So how do you avoid a failed marriage? It's simple. Follow God's plan. Follow God's plan. Follow God's plan. God created marriage, and He knows what works best in marriage. We just need to let go of our assumptions, our pride, and our worldliness to start appreciating it. So, prepare for marriage seriously and spiritually instead of just casually and socially. 2, do more than just make a commitment to one another, live a commitment to one another and to God. 3, Be good stewards of your money, your work, and your spending. 4, make unselfishness your aim, not an accident. Number 5, communicate regularly and proactively in order to set aside doubt and build greater unity. 6, develop emotional intimacy as the anchor of your hearts. And 7, love one another in marriage as God loves all the time. Proverbs 18, verse 22 says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. And the opposite of that is also true. But it does come with this caveat. You cannot enjoy all the blessings of marriage until you first embrace God's design for marriage. It cannot be done. And that's why we need to be all in to God's way, all in to what we ought to be. God's way will work every time when it is applied correctly. Every time.